Hey couples, it's Brian and Tracy, and if you've ever been at this place in your marriage where everything that your spouse does annoys you, then today's lesson is just for you, because we're going to talk about the difference between failing and thriving in your marriage in the context of a couple of things called positive sentiment override and negative sentiment override.
So this is a concept by John Gottman and his study of couples and how they're able to predict divorce by like 98% because they watch couples in their love lab and they've kind of studied what are the couples doing that succeed and what do the couples do that don't. And so this idea of the negative sentiment override versus the positive sentiment override has come out of his study, and it's very interesting, and I want you guys to be thinking, which one best describes me and my spouse?
All right, so let's start with definitions on the left side of this chart. If you have positive sentiment override toward your spouse, that means you choose to see the best in your spouse, focusing on the things you love and respect about him or her. And that means in crisis, you respond with grace. You recognize that your spouse made a mistake, you forgive, and then you move on.
So the positive sentiment override's pretty obvious. This is you looking at your spouse with not rosy colored glasses, but with kind rosy glasses, right? That you see the best in your spouse, you focus more on the things you love about them and respect about them. So then in the crisis time, or a time that you get into conflict, if you have positive sentiment override, then everything doesn't have to go down the tubes when your spouse disappoints you, because that positive sentiment override, you're able to say, you know what, you made a mistake. You're having a bad day. That's not typical of you. So I'm going to be forgiving and we're going to talk about it and we can move on. So that's how the positive sentiment override really helps couples when they come up against conflict, have the ability to move through it in a quicker, better way, because you see your spouse and you think the best of them.
Now, the opposite of that then is negative sentiment override, and this is where you choose to see the worst in your spouse. You focus on the things that hurt or annoy you, and then what that means in crisis is that you respond in disgust. You conclude that this is just another example of a flawed spouse, and of course you stay bitter, you never forgive, you never seem to be able to move on from crisis in your marriage.
So you can see how the negative sentiment override can really get couples in trouble quickly. And maybe that's been your experience. You and your spouse have been struggling through some things, and your perspective is you just think your spouse maybe is selfish or a jerk, and everything that they do moving forward is likely not going to meet your standard, and they're disappointing to you. And so you're just kind of bitter. So you look at your spouse with eyes of criticism, not with grace, like you saw in the positive sentiment override. It's more of waiting to see them mess up again. So the problem with that then is when you get into conflict and a disappointing event happens, instead of choosing to say, okay, this is an isolated event, I trust the character of my spouse, so, we'll talk about it and move on. No, the negative sentiment override is you're thinking to yourself, no, this is just another example of why I don't care about my spouse as much anymore, why they're a disappointment to me, why I don't have a lot of hope for our relationship. And you're just kind of stuck in that place of focusing on the negative. The worst way you could see your spouse and their intentions, that's what you focus on. So couples, especially those of you that would say, after listening to this video today, I think we have ourselves in a negative sentiment override situation, maybe you or maybe your spouse. So I don't want you to lose all hope here, because if you can recognize that that's kind of your perspective, the lens that you see your marriage through is more through the negative lens of, I just don't see a lot of positives in the situation or even in the character of my spouse, then I just want to encourage you, there's some things you can do to change that sentiment, that overriding view of your relationship. And it really starts with talking about where the damage has been done in your relationship of broken trust, right? We talk a lot about EQ, kind of the emotional intelligence things on this channel. We've talked about that a lot before. John Gottman talks about this idea of attunement, that if you want to get to a place with your spouse where you're not in the negative sentiment override, then you need to start learning how to communicate in a way that breeds trust. Meaning that you can sit down with your spouse and that you would have a heart to say, I just want to listen to you and your perspective. I don't want to be defensive. I don't want to be trying to combat or say you're wrong. I just want to listen to your perspective. I want to understand your perspective. Then I want you to be able to understand my perspective. And then where do we go from here? And that's kind of a trust building exercise where you get to a place where you could say, I trust that my spouse's heart is for me and for our marriage. But that's going to take some work, and it's going to have to start with the way you communicate, the way you show the empathetic listening, right? I want to hear your perspective. I want to understand it. I want to be a better spouse for you. And those are the things that you can start building some trust. And then lo and behold, as you gain more and more trust and build that into the foundation of the relationship, you can start to switch from the negative sentiment override to start seeing some of those positives. You know, being reminded of, what did I fall in love with my spouse in the first place? You know, John Gottman also talks about the love map. How do you reconnect with your spouse and be reminded of how you dated, why you dated, what was your engagement story, what are the things you care about, and getting reconnected as a couple and kind of rewriting the story a little bit. So those are just a few practical things that you could start doing if you want to move from that negative sentiment override to get to the positive sentiment override.